In this presentation, I'm going to outline the topic of economic environment in global marketing and international business. Some points outlined in these presentations are: the first, intertwined world economy, country competitiveness, emerging economies, regional economic arrangements, and multinational corporations. At no other time in economic history have countries been more economically interdependent than they are today. Although the second half of the 20th century saw the highest ever sustained growth rate in GDP in history, the growth in international flows in goods and service, or called international trade, has consistently surpassed the growth rate of the world economy. This is thanks to trade liberalization. The barriers to international trade and financial flows keep getting lower. A further strengthening of trade and investment links between regions and countries contributed largely to the outstanding trade growth performance in an adverse global environment. Globalization has helped improve the economies of emerging and developing countries more than those of developed countries. The gap in real GDP growth rate between emerging countries and developed countries widened from 0 in 1991 to about 5 points in 2008. Helping poorer countries catch up economically has long been among the benefits touted for globalization. Unfortunately, the current global recession has caused exactly the reverse. The economic downturn has been sharpest in countries that open up most to world trade, especially East Asian countries. For example, Taiwan export are over 60% of GDP, and its economy might fall more than 10% if recession hits globally. The first topic of this presentation is intertwined world economy. There is no question that the global economy continues to become more intertwined. Whether the world economy was in a growth mode or is in a severe recession mode, the current global recession has made all of us aware that countries are ever more interdependent of each other. For example, in 2018, about 15% of what Americans consume was imported. So this is measured based on the ratio of the country's import to its GDP. The US is relatively more insulated from external shocks compared to Britain or Thailand, which in 2018 the imports to GDP ratio for Britain and Thailand are about 32% and 50% respectively. However, the US economy too is now getting increasingly intertwined with the rest of the world economy. And in general, the larger the country's domestic economy, the less dependent it tends to be on export and imports relative to its GDP. Also, the implication is the higher the per capita trade, the more closely intertwined is that country's economy with the rest of the world. Intertwining of economies by the process of specialization due to international trade leads to job creation in both the exporting country and the importing country. Apart from trade flows, foreign direct investment, portfolio investment, and daily financial flows in the international money markets profoundly influence the economies of countries that may be seemingly completely separate. Foreign direct investment, which means investment in manufacturing and service facility in a foreign country with an intention to engage actively in managing them. As seen in the figure, the overall world inflow of foreign direct investment, reflected in the gray lines, increased from 2005 to 2017. This continued rise in FDI flow across regions largely reflects strong economic growth and performance in many parts of the world. Global FDI flow also largely resulted from a weakening US dollar in some period. And in this figure also displayed that FDI inflow is strong in the developing economies, which reflected in the orange line. This is due to the lower cost of operation in the developing economies in terms of labor cost and also material cost. That's the reason why FDI number is higher to this entering these countries. And also developing economies showing a promising trend in terms of the growing of middle consumer market. Therefore, more and more multinational companies are interested to invest in these developing economies. Two things should be noted that in the past, foreign direct investment was considered as an alternative to exports in order to avoid tariff barriers. However, these days, foreign direct investment and international trade have become complementary. For example, the computer uses a factory in Ireland to supply personal computers in Europe instead of exporting from Austin, Texas. Similarly, Honda, a Japanese automaker with a major factory in Marysville, Ohio, is the largest exporter of automobiles from the United States. The increase in foreign direct investment is also promoted by efforts by many national governments to attract multinationals and by the leverage that the governments of large potential markets such as China and India have in granting access to multinationals. Sometimes trade friction can also promote foreign direct investment. For example, investment in the US by Japanese company is, to an extent, a function of the trade imbalance between the two nations, and by the consequent pressure applied by the US government on Japan to do something to reduce the bilateral trade deficit. Since most of the US trade deficit with Japan is attributed to Japanese cars exported from Japan, Japanese automakers such as Honda, Toyota, Nissan, and Mitsubishi have expanded their local production by setting up production facilities in the US. Other aspect that influence the economies of a country is portfolio investment. Portfolio investment refers to investment in foreign countries that are withdrawable at short notice, such as investment in foreign stocks and bonds. In the international financial markets, the borders between nations have, for all practical purposes, disappeared. Another aspect is international financial market, is including foreign currency trading as an adjunct transaction to an international trade transaction in goods and services, where banks and firms bought and sold currency to complete the export or import transaction. However, in today's international financial markets, traders and trade currency most of the time without an underlying trade transaction. They trade on the accounts of the banks and financial institutions they work for, mostly on the basis of daily news on inflation rates, interest rates, political events, stock and bond market movements, commodity supplies and demand, and so on. As mentioned earlier, the weekly volume of international trade in currency exceeds the annual value of the trade in goods and services. An interesting example is the Mexican meltdown in early 1995 and the massive devaluation of the peso, which was exacerbated by the withdrawal of money by foreign investors, and the massive depreciation of many Asian currencies in the 1997 to 1999 period, known as the Asian financial crisis, is also an example of the influence of these short-term movements of money. And unfortunately, the influence of these short-term money flows are nowadays far more powerful determinant of exchange rates than any investment by multinational companies. A rising currency value will also deter foreign investment in the country and will encourage outflow of investment. It may also encourage a decrease in interest rate in the country if the central bank of that country wants to maintain the currency exchange rate, and a decrease in the interest rate would spur local investment. The next topic is country competitiveness. Country competitiveness refers to the productiveness of a country, which is represented by its firm's domestic and international productive capacity. Human, natural, and capital resources of a country primarily shape the nature of corporate productive capacity in the world and thus the nature of international business. A country's relative endowment in those resources shape its competitiveness. Country competitiveness is not a fixed thing. The dominant feature of the global economy is the rapid change in the relative status of various countries' economic output. As depicted in the figures, the country competitiveness is not a fixed thing. In the Global Competitiveness Index, it was seen that the countries ranked top 10 of the most competitive economies, they change over time. The role of human resources has become increasingly important as a primary determinant of industry and country competitiveness as the level of technology has advanced. Singapore, one of the four Asian tigers, consistently ranked among the world's top 10 economies. Another of the four Asian tigers, Taiwan, also ranked within top 10. These two Asian countries have virtually no natural resources to rely on for building their competitiveness. Clearly, human resources are crucial for the long-term economic vitality of natural resource poor countries. Nordic countries share a number of characteristics that make them extremely competitive, such as very healthy macroeconomic environments and highly transparent and efficient public institutions, with general agreement within society on the spending priorities to be met in the government budget. While the business communities in the Nordic countries point to high tax rate as a potential problem area, there is no evidence that these are adversely affecting the ability of these countries to compete effectively in world markets or to provide to their respective population some of the highest standard of living in the world. Indeed, the high levels of government tax revenue have delivered world-class educational establishment, an extensive safety net, and a highly motivated and skilled labor force. The next point is emerging economies. Large economies and large trading partners have been located mostly in the trade regions of the world. They are North America, Western Europe, and Japan, which collectively producing over 80% of the world GDP, with only 20% of the world's population in much of the 20th century. However, in the next 10 to 20 years, the greatest commercial opportunities are expected to be found increasingly in 10 big emerging markets, including the Chinese economic area, China, Hong Kong, and Taiwan, India, South Korea, Mexico, Brazil, and ASEAN, including Indonesia. For instance, in the past 20 years, China's real annual GDP growth rate has averaged 9.5% a year, while India has been 5.7% compared to the average 3% GDP growth rate in the US. Companies like Hewlett-Packard are benefiting a lot from the emerging market. For example, growth in such markets such as Brazil, Russia, India, and China is helping Hewlett-Packard to shrug off the effect of a slowdown in the US. and prompt the company to raise its sales forecast. However, we should also realize that an increasing number of competitors are expected to originate from those emerging economies. As a result, over the next 2 decades, the markets that hold the greatest potential for dramatic increase in US export are not the traditional trading partners in Europe and Japan, which now account for the overwhelming bulk of the international trade of the US, but they will be those big emerging markets. For example, India has increasingly become a hotbed as source of information technology, communications, software development, and call centers, particularly for many US multinationals. Russia is extremely rich in natural resources, including oil and natural gas, which are dwindling in the rest of the world and has gradually warmed up to international commerce and will potentially become a major trading nation. As these three leading emerging economies, among others, are likely to reshape the nature of the international business in the next decade. Marketing in emerging markets requirement is contextually different from marketing in developed countries. Companies that have succeeded in developed countries may or may not be able to approach those emerging markets the same way. When they enter huge emerging markets in rapidly developing economies, Western companies or multinational companies typically bring with them US, Japanese, or Western European quality standard, dismissing local good as inferior. They know there is a great hunger in those countries for Western good in the same way as developed country consumers and business might buy in New York, London, or Tokyo. However, they forget that, in spite of the lust for high-quality Western goods, relatively few developing country customers can afford them. In terms of price and quality, most developing country customers weigh more on the former and choose not up to Western standard but good enough and inexpensive local products. The local companies making this good enough product, costing up to 75% less than Western brands, are actually serious challengers of their developed country rivals, especially given that they will finally produce ever better product as they gain scale, lower costs, and invest in R&D. For example, like Nokia did not realize that while Nokia was focusing on the biggest cities with Western-grade handset, local challengers were gradually taking up the populous countryside by selling good enough handset. Soon, Nokia and local challengers' positions were reversed. Nokia market share fell from 30% to the low teens. Like Nokia, many developed country firms fail to fully understand the competitive environment in those emerging markets. They enter these emerging markets ready to sell existing high-end products to increasingly prosperous city dwellers. It might work for a while, but not forever. Next point is regional economic arrangement. An evolving trend in international economic activity is the formation of multinational trading blocs. These blocs take the form of a group of countries that decide to have common trading policies for the rest of the world in terms of tariffs and market access, but have preferential treatment for one another. The universal reason for the formation of such group is to ensure the economic growth and benefit of the participating countries. Some example of regional economic arrangement is Mercosur, which is the Southern Free Trade Area, GCC, which is Gulf Cooperation Council in the Arabian Gulf region, SAARC, which is the South Asian Agreement for Regional Cooperation in South Asia, and ASEAN, Association of Southeast Asian Nations. The existence and growing influence of these multinational groupings implies that nations need to become part of such groups to remain globally competitive. Here are the evolutions of regional arrangement, starting from free trade area to political union. I will outline the first regional economic arrangement, which is free trade area. Free trade area is a formal agreement among two or more countries to reduce or eliminate custom duties and non-tariff trade barriers among partner countries. However, member countries are free to maintain individual tariff schedules for countries that do not belong to the free trade group. One fundamental problem with this arrangement is that a free trade area can be circumvented by non-member countries that can export to the nation having the lowest external tariff in a free trade area, and then transport the goods to the destination country in the free trade area without paying the higher tariff applicable if it had gone directly to the destination country. In order to stem foreign companies from benefiting from this tariff avoiding method of exporting, local content laws are usually introduced. Local content laws require that in order for a product to be considered domestic, thus not subject to import duties, a certain percentage or more of the value of the product should be sourced locally within the free trade area. Thus, local content laws are designed to encourage foreign exporters to set up their manufacturing location in the free trade area. The inherent weaknesses of the free trade area concept may lead to its gradual disappearance in the future, although it may continue to be an attractive stepping stone to a higher level of integration. The next level of integration is custom unions. Custom unions is when members of a free trade area add common external tariff to the provisions of the free trade agreement. Then the free trade area becomes a custom union. Therefore, members of a custom union not only have reduced or eliminated tariff among themselves, but also they have a common external tariff of countries that are not members of the custom unions. This prevents non-member countries from exporting to a member countries that have low external tariff with the goal of sending the exports to a country that has a higher external tariff through the first country that has a low external tariff. The ASEAN Association of East Asian Nations is an example of the currently functional custom union with the goal of a common market. Berikutnya adalah custom union. Jadi custom union ini terjadi apabila member dari free trade area mereka memasang eksternal tarif yang sama bagi negara-negara yang merupakan non-member. Jadi hal ini mencegah negara-negara non-member untuk melakukan penghindaran tarif tadi atau melakukan kecurangan. Di mana non-member country ini dapat mengekspor ke negara member yang memiliki eksternal tarif paling rendah. Kemudian mereka mengirimkan produknya ke negara tujuan dengan tarif eksternal yang lebih tinggi, sehingga mereka menghindari eksternal tarif yang lebih tinggi apabila mereka mengekspor langsung ke negara tujuan tersebut. Sehingga custom union merupakan move untuk mengurangi atau menghindari adanya kecurangan ini. As cooperation increase among the countries of a custom union, they can form then a common market. In a common market, countries eliminate all tariffs and other barriers to trade among members of the common market, adopts a common set of external tariff on non-members, and removes all restriction on the flow of capital and labor among member nations. The example of a common market is the European Union. Level berikutnya dari perjanjian ekonomi regional adalah common market. Pada perjanjian common market, negara-negara member mengeliminasi semua tarif dan hambatan perdagangan antar negara-negara member tersebut. Mereka juga mengadopsi atau menentukan tarif eksternal yang sama bagi negara-negara non-member yang ingin memasarkan produknya di negara member tersebut. Dan mereka juga menghilangkan semua hambatan pada arus modal dan tenaga kerja antar negara-negara member, sehingga tidak ada lagi hambatan bagi tenaga kerja untuk bermigrasi ke negara member untuk mencari pekerjaan. A monetary union represents the fourth level of integration with a single common currency among politically independent countries. The example is how euro is used as a currency in the European Union. Monetary Union merepresentasikan level keempat dari integrasi ekonomi regional, di mana mereka mengadopsi satu mata uang yang sama dalam satu region. Hal ini dilakukan oleh European Economic Community dengan mata uang euro. The culmination of the process of integration is the creation of a political union. A political union involves the adoption of a constitution for an enlarged regional union. But not all countries members would agree with this union because they have the member countries, they have varying levels of concern about ceding any part of their sovereignty to any envisaged political union. And some member countries may also vote against the constitution to protect their jobs, employment rights, and social benefits from low-cost, low-tax, deregulated countries. The multinational corporation influence in international trade and investment will continue to increase over time. There are four reasons behind this trend. The first is the forces of economies of scale, and the second is the lowering trade and investment barriers which attract multinational corporations to enter more and more countries. And the third reason is their need to be close to market to be able to serve the local market better. And the fourth reason is the diffusion of technology.